The people of Willow Creek had long accepted that Luke Maddox, the quiet rancher with the storm-gray eyes and stubborn jawline, was destined to live out his life alone. He kept to himself, worked from dawn until dusk, and brushed off every woman the local matchmakers tried to nudge his way. Some found his solitude mysterious. Others called it pride. But the truth lay buried deeper. Luke had once loved and lost, and the wound had sealed over with a shell so thick no one could break through. So whenever a hopeful widow or a blushing schoolteacher hinted at a dance or a dinner, Luke simply tipped his hat politely and walked away. The ladies sighed, the gossip churned, and winter after winter passed with Luke eating dinner alone at the end of a long wooden table built for a family he no longer believed he'd ever have. But in the fall, when the leaves turned gold, a woman arrived in Willow Creek who wasn't interested in whispering or chasing. Her name was Clara Hayes, and she came from 2 towns over with nothing but a suitcase, a stubborn streak, and the determination to rebuild her life after a failed engagement that had left her humiliated and broke. She rented a small room above the general store and took a job organizing supplies and tending customers. She wasn't loud or flirtatious like some of the town's more eager young women. She wasn't fragile or timid either. She worked hard, kept her chin high, and treated everyone with a kind honesty they weren't used to. And while she wasn't chasing Luke, she was the first woman in years who didn't shrink beneath his silence when he stopped by for feed or tools. In fact, she looked him straight in the eye, the only person in town who did. Clara noticed how he kept turning down invitations to the harvest dance, how he avoided small talk, how he disappeared whenever someone hinted about marriage. She found it both aggravating and fascinating, not because she wanted him for herself, at least not at first, but because she couldn't stand how everyone tiptoed around a man who clearly needed something or someone and was too stubborn to admit it. One chilly afternoon, when he came in for supplies right as the first snowflakes of the season began drifting outside the window, she struck up a conversation. Luke responded with his usual one-word answers. Most people took the hint and backed off. Clara didn't. She leaned on the counter and said calmly, "You planning to spend another winter talking only to cows and fence posts?" Luke blinked, stunned that anyone dared speak to him that way. The shock almost made him smile, almost. Over the next few weeks, their conversations continued, sometimes because Luke lingered a few seconds longer than necessary, sometimes because Clara pushed him. She learned he was lonely, though he'd never say it outright. He learned she was braver than she looked, though she'd never brag. When he walked her home one night after she closed the shop late and the streets were empty and frosty, something shifted between them. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt right. But still, Luke kept his walls up, afraid that letting someone in meant losing everything again. The turning point came on a brutally cold morning just before Christmas. Clara had slipped on the ice behind the store and badly sprained her ankle. Luke, happening to pass by, carried her to her room as gently as if she were made of glass. He stayed to make sure she had food, water, blankets, and medicine, even chopping wood for her stove without being asked. Clara watched him move around the tiny room, rough and quiet, yet overflowing with unspoken care. Finally, frustrated by his silence and the way he kept treating his own loneliness like a badge of honor, she said the words that stopped him in his tracks. "Tell me something, Luke Maddox. You want a wife, or do you just want another winter alone?" Luke froze, the question hitting him harder than any storm. She didn't ask in a flirtatious way, nor as a challenge. She asked with sincerity, as someone who saw through every layer he'd spent years building. He could have lied. He could have laughed. He could have walked out the door. But for the first time in a decade, he let himself tell the truth. He sat at the edge of her bed, rubbed his calloused hands together, and whispered, "I don't want to be alone anymore. I just don't know how to start again." Clara reached out, resting her hand lightly on his. "Then start with me," she said softly, "not as a promise, not as a proposal, just as a beginning." From that moment, the walls around Luke's heart finally cracked. He visited her daily until she healed, and when she returned to work, he walked her there in the morning and back again in the evening. People in town began whispering, but for once the gossip didn't bother him. Clara didn't push for anything more than he could give, Yet somehow he found himself giving more each day, sharing stories about his past, laughing more freely, showing up with warm bread or firewood without being asked. By spring, Luke realized he wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't alone. He wasn't lost. And the woman who had asked him the boldest question he'd ever heard had become the one person he couldn't imagine a day without. So one warm April morning, beneath the budding cottonwoods on his ranch, Luke took Clara's hands in his and asked her a question of his own, one that made her eyes fill with tears and her smile bloom brighter than the sunrise. And that time, she didn't ask if he wanted a wife or another winter alone. She just said yes. He didn't answer her at first. The wind howled between them, carrying flecks of snow that clung to his coat and her lashes, the silence stretching long enough for her to feel her heartbeat in her throat. For years, women in town had tried to win him over warm smiles, homemade pies, bold invitations, but he had shut every single one of them down with the same quiet, distant shake of his head. Yet now, standing before this woman who had shown up on his land with fire in her voice and stubbornness in her eyes, something inside him shifted like thawing ice. Her question wasn't teasing, wasn't desperate, wasn't flirtatious. It was honest. It was raw, and it cut straight to the truth he'd buried deeper than any winter snow. She tightened the blanket around her shoulders, waiting, refusing to let him dodge it the way he had with everyone else. She wasn't afraid of silence and wasn't afraid of him. Not his size, not his roughness, not his reputation for keeping people at arm's length. In fact, she looked at him as if she saw right through the layers he'd built, right through the solitude he claimed was a choice. He felt it, felt her gaze digging under his ribs, unearthing something he didn't want to name. Well. She pressed softly, the question lingering between them like smoke from a dying fire. Which is it? A partner, or another winter talking to your horse because no one else is there? The cowboy exhaled. A breath that looked almost painful, his jaw working as he searched for the words he never thought he'd have to say out loud. He'd built his whole life around silence, around routine, around a quiet loneliness that hurt less when he pretended he preferred it. But as he looked at her, this woman who had walked through cold and trouble to end up on his porch, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the sharp ache of wanting, not just company, not just help on the ranch. Someone who would talk back, challenge him, stand beside him when the worst of winter hit. Someone who wasn't afraid of him or his heart. "I want," he began, the words catching like burrs in his throat. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint tremble in her hands from the cold, close enough that the scarf around her neck brushed against his coat. But her eyes, those steady, stubborn eyes, never wavered. She wasn't offering him comfort. She wasn't offering pity. She was offering a choice. "If you want a wife," she murmured, "you should ask for one. If you want to stay alone, then say that. But don't keep people away and then pretend it's because no one wants you." Her breath made a small cloud in the air between them. "You're the one deciding to freeze." His chest tightened, not from the wind but from the truth she just carved open. All these years, he'd been the one shutting doors, pushing hands away, convincing himself winter didn't hurt if he didn't let anyone close enough to warm it. But here she was, shivering, stubborn, calling out every wall he'd ever built. And for the first time he felt the fear of losing something he hadn't even let himself reach for. He swallowed hard, his voice rough when it finally emerged. "I don't want another winter alone," he admitted, "but I don't know how to be anything else." And she smiled, small but real, as if that was the first honest thing he'd ever said. She reached out slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, but he didn't. Her fingers brushed his, chilled and trembling, and something inside him jolted awake, something long buried under seasons of silence and hard work. "No one knows how to start," she said softly. "You just do it. You just decide this winter won't be like the last one." Her voice cracked a little, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "You're not the only one who's been alone, you know." And that simple truth hit him harder than any blizzard ever had. She wasn't here to fix him. She wasn't asking him to fix her. She was asking if he wanted to try together. He studied her, the fire in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. She wasn't like the other women in town, not gentler, not louder, not more charming, just real, honest. and brave enough to ask the question no one else had dared. "You think you could handle a life out here?" he asked, the ghost of a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "It's rough, hard, cold. Every winter tests you." She lifted her chin, a spark of challenge lighting her expression. "So do I," and for the first time in a long, long while, he felt a laugh tug at his chest. The wind cut between them, sharp and fierce, but neither stepped back. He could see her breath shaking in the air, could see the determination that kept her standing there even though she was freezing. It dawned on him then. She wanted a life that meant something, a place where she wasn't just talked over or brushed aside. She wanted to matter. And he had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone to matter to him. But now, staring at her, he realized how empty the ranch felt when the night stretched long, and the only sound was the creak of the old beams settling in the dark. "It's been a long time since someone stood here and asked me something real," he murmured. Her expression softened, the fight in her fading into something gentler. "Then answer it real." A simple request, but it hit with the weight of a promise. He took a slow breath, the cold biting at his lungs, and looked toward the dark shape of his cabin, the place that had always kept him safe, but also kept him isolated. Then he looked back at her, at the woman who wasn't offering comfort or softness but truth and partnership. "I don't want to be alone anymore," he said finally, the words almost fragile. "But I don't know if I deserve anything different." She didn't hesitate. "You don't earn warmth," she said. "You share it." Her voice was steady, a calm warmth cutting through the winter air. "You don't need to be perfect, you just need to let someone stay." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the faint shake in her body, close enough that he instinctively moved his coat around her shoulders. She didn't thank him, she didn't need to, because in that moment they both understood something had shifted. Winter hadn't ended. But it no longer felt like something they had to survive alone.